My mother's boyfriend visited us and brought a big surprise. Good afternoon to everyone on the Secrets of Betrayal channel. I ask for your understanding and please avoid judgment about what I'm about to share. I agreed to open up here because I really had to face this situation in order to survive. My name is Madison. I'm 23 years old, and I live with my mother, Grace, in Laredo. Our house, although simple, is a real cozy refuge and is located in a privileged area of the city. This home was the only asset my father left us, and for that we are eternally grateful. He died suddenly in 2022, the victim of a massive heart attack at the age of 50. His departure was a devastating shock for us, not only emotionally but also financially. My father had always been the foundation of our family. He was the breadwinner, took care of all the bills, and always insisted that my mother and I didn't need to work, so we lived without worries, enjoying life without thinking about tomorrow. We never felt the need to think about savings or a plan for the future. When he left, we discovered that we had no financial reserves, nothing apart from the house he had left us. Everything we had was invested in our daily lives, and his sudden death forced us to face a new reality. We would have to make do on our own to survive, whatever the cost. My mother, Grace, is 46 years old and still attracts stares wherever she goes. Brunette, with a well-groomed body and curly hair and intense green eyes, she has a beauty that makes people look twice. Since my father's death, she has started looking for a job, but without many qualifications or courses, she has encountered many difficulties. Even though she was so beautiful and competent, the job market wasn't kind to her. After a lot of effort and perseverance, my mother finally got a position as a cashier in a supermarket. It was a difficult task, as she had never worked outside the home. But now this job is what helps us keep the house. I also do what I can to contribute. I do some odd jobs in cafeterias and bars to supplement my income and try to make ends meet. But balancing all this with college has proved to be a real challenge. With this intense routine, I barely have time to think about relationships, let alone finding a boyfriend. Despite this hectic life, I often hear people comment that I inherited my mother's beauty. They say we look so much alike that we could easily be mistaken for sisters, and that always brings a smile to my face. My mother, in an attempt to erase the memories of my father, started going out with her friends and soon found several boyfriends. The problem was that most of them were no good, and in the end, she always ended the relationships. It was then that she began to take an interest in rich men, or at least those who had a much more comfortable financial situation. When she brought these guys home, I could see their eyes on me, and they weren't discreet at all. My mother noticed too, but she always remained confident in me. We have a very strong relationship, and she knows that I would never betray her trust, let alone with one of her boyfriends. As time went by, my mother began to enjoy the game. These men were looking for something quick, just an adventure, and she learned to take advantage of the situation. Now, she makes sure they pay all the household bills, from electricity and water to internet and groceries. She knows how to play with them, and while they're together, they end up paying what they can. My mother's boyfriend is currently Drake, a wealthy truck driver in his 50s. He made his fortune transporting cigarettes and booze in the 90s, when he was still young and full of energy. Nowadays, he's in charge of a fleet of trucks, and from time to time, still hits the road out of sheer nostalgia for the old days. My mother met Drake in the supermarket, where he was instantly charmed by her beauty. With that charming way she has, it wasn't long before she decided to give him her phone number. After a few conversations and outings, they finally started dating. Drake is the typical good catch, a true prince who, despite his age, still has an irresistible charm. Even though he's a bit on the chubby side, he dresses very well, always impeccably, with a close shave and a style that really catches the eye. And, of course, he's always adorned with his shiny gold bracelets and chains, something he seems to love. Before introducing me to him, my mother was already telling me that the guy has more than 5 cars in his garage, and that almost every day he makes a Pix for her to spend on whatever she wants, whether it's nails, hair, or even buying presents. He's definitely the most generous boyfriend my mother has ever had, the kind of man who goes to great lengths to show off his wealth. When my mother decided it was time to introduce Drake to me and to our home, she was very serious and strict about the situation. She didn't want it to be just any introduction. "I want you to wear those short, tight shorts," she said, appraising me from top to toe, "something that really highlights your curves." She was always direct and had a clear plan in mind. The idea was simple: treat Drake like a king, making him feel in control, as if our house was his castle and we were his servants. "These transfers he's already made to me will ensure that our bills are paid for at least 2 months," she continued, with a calculating look on her face. We knew that men like Drake, flush with money and power, don't hold back for long, so we needed to play our cards right. I had no problem accepting the plan. We were in a complicated situation, and anything that could guarantee our stability was worth the effort. Besides, my mother always knew how to manage. And this time, we were in it together. She wanted to make sure Drake stayed for a long time, and I was ready to do whatever it took to help. After this conversation, my mother arranged a lunch on Sunday so that Drake could meet me and spend some time with us. On Saturday, she handed me $300 with a confident smile and said, "Go to the market and buy the best you can afford. I want prime meat, snacks that impress, beautiful fruit, and of course, good wine." We prepared everything with such care, as if we were putting on a real show for him. It wasn't just lunch, it was our chance to keep the game going. I took the plan very seriously, aware that every detail made a difference. When he arrived, everything would be flawless, and both my mother and I were determined to do our best to ensure that Drake was more than satisfied. Before going any further with this true story of infidelity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. On Sunday, the house was radiant, shining as if we were expecting a presidential visit. My mother and I dedicated ourselves to every detail, cleaning and organizing everything with extreme care. The place was ready to impress, and we knew it was crucial to make an excellent impression. With only a few hours left before Drake's arrival, we began to prepare. I took a relaxing shower, perfumed myself with a seductive scent, and put on the shorts my mother had suggested, which accentuated every curve and transformed me into a real woman. I completed the look with a low-cut top that left little to the imagination and slathered my body with moisturizer so that my skin was soft and glowing. My nails were perfectly done, and I felt truly irresistible. The anticipation in the air was palpable, and the feeling that we were about to do something big made me even more excited. My mother looked stunning, too. She had chosen a tropical dress, loose and low-cut, which highlighted her body in a glamorous way. The volume and décolleté were eye-catching, making her look even more attractive. She was radiant, full of charm and an infectious smile. With everything ready, we were both eager and ready to welcome Drake and do our best to make him feel special. When we heard the sound of the horn close by, our hearts beat faster. It was Drake arriving. My mother immediately got up to answer the door, while I, full of curiosity, ran to the window to peek in. I looked through the glass and saw the huge black truck parked in the driveway. The vehicle shone in the sunlight and had an imposing air about it, which revealed from afar that this was no ordinary car. Although I didn't know much about cars, it was clear that this car cost a fortune. The presence of the vehicle reinforced the image of wealth and status that Drake carried. Drake got out of the car with a huge bouquet of flowers and a sophisticated box of chocolates, clearly chosen to impress my mother. As soon as she saw the presents, her joy was so great that she started jumping for joy right there on the doorstep. Drake approached, and the two met in a warm embrace, followed by a passionate kiss, as if they were two young people in love. The scene was enchanting. My mother, still beaming, invited Drake to come in and make himself at home. With a smile on her face, she explained that she and I had prepared a special lunch in his honor. "Come in, make yourself at home," she said, as she led him inside. "We've lovingly prepared everything for you. Welcome." When Drake came in, he threw himself on the living room sofa, letting himself be surrounded by the coziness of the house, while praising the decor and, of course, my mother's beauty. She smiled with satisfaction at every word. I was in the kitchen, fixing the last details of lunch, but I couldn't ignore the laughter and the mood that was building in the living room. For a long time, they were talking and getting even closer. They ended up making out right there on the living room sofa. My nerves were on edge, waiting for my mother to call me. Finally, after a few minutes, I heard my mother calling me with a light, seductive tone. "Daughter, come and meet Drake." It was my cue to enter the scene, and I knew I had to make the best impression. When my mother called me, I put a smile on my face and walked into the living room with wine glasses in my hands. As soon as Drake saw me, he stopped for a moment, his eyes shining with surprise, clearly impressed. My mother immediately noticed his reaction and, satisfied, let out a little smile, as if she had everything under control. I came closer, and Drake, all charisma, stood up to greet me. He gave me a tight hug, almost as if we were old acquaintances, and said something like, "Now I understand where all this beauty comes from." I laughed, trying to be nice, and returned the compliment by saying that he was also very charming, which went perfectly with my mother. He laughed back, his eyes never ceasing to analyze me with obvious curiosity. My mother, watching everything with a satisfied look, took advantage of the moment to say that she was going to the kitchen to get some snacks, leaving us alone in the living room for a few minutes. As she walked away, I noticed that Drake was still looking at me, clearly interested. The atmosphere between us was light, but also charged with a certain air of curiosity, as if we were both playing the same game, but carefully. I felt completely at ease talking to Drake. He had that charismatic, relaxed way about him that made everything easier. When my mother left to prepare the appetizers, he started chatting about my personal life, casting a curious glance in my direction and asking, "A beautiful, attractive woman like you doesn't have a boyfriend to hold on to?" Hard to believe. I couldn't help laughing at his directness. I thanked him for his compliments and explained that I didn't really have anyone at the moment. I said I liked being alone, so I didn't have to give anyone any satisfaction. Drake's eyes widened, as if he'd heard something he liked, and with an excited smile, he replied, "What you like is a mess, don't you, my child?" Dating for what? His sincerity brought a genuine laugh from me. He really was a character, the kind who spoke his mind bluntly. The mood was light and, somehow, the conversation was getting funnier and funnier. After a few minutes, my mother returned with a platter of cold cuts that looked like it was worthy of a banquet. There was everything: salami, perfectly cut tomatoes, olives, and a selection of cheeses that would make anyone's mouth water. The presentation was impeccable, as if we had prepared everything especially to impress. She sat down next to us, and we started snacking and chatting. Drake, grinning from ear to ear, was clearly enjoying the situation. He couldn't stop eating and complimenting us, looking incredibly happy to be there with both of us. It was clear that he felt like a king, being served and being the absolute center of our attention. After a lot of chatter and a few glasses of wine, we decided it was time for lunch. I got up and led the way to the dining table, making sure Drake didn't get lost in the middle of the room. My mother followed close behind, forming a sort of procession around him. With two beautiful women by his side, Drake didn't seem to know where to look first. We reached the table and began to serve ourselves. The food was delicious. My mother had really made it her own. Drake seemed to love it. He couldn't stop eating and laughing. I exchanged glances with my mother. We knew our plan was working. He was so comfortable that we could see we were in control of the situation. When we'd finished lunch, Drake went into the living room to rest. We took advantage of the moment to wash the dishes quickly, talking quietly about what to do next. I knew it was time to take a few more risks. "Mom, have you seen the way he looks at me? If he could have both of us, do you know what that would mean?" He'd put a lot of money in the house. My mother looked at me with a surprised expression, and after a moment's thought, let out a sideways smile. "Clever girl, you've outdone your mother," she said, clearly impressed by the idea. So we started planning. The idea was for me to seduce Drake, creating the impression that it was just between us. my mother would be oblivious to our game, which would allow us to exploit the situation to the full. The aim was to make him feel comfortable and generous, without realizing that we were playing the same game as him. The end of the plan was as follows. My mother would leave the house for a while, claiming that she needed to buy a dessert at the nearby grocery store. In the meantime, I would go back to the living room and have a chance to talk to Drake more, trying to create a mood to see if I could get a kiss. The aim was to use this opportunity to increase our influence over him and ensure that our plan was a success. My mother quickly dried her hands on the towel and entered the room, looking urgent. "Drake, I'm going to the grocery store to get some ice cream. I won't be long." She didn't even wait for an answer and was already out the door. With her gone, it was my turn to take charge of the scene. I returned to the living room with 2 glasses of wine in my hands. The drink was already making me a little dizzy, and I realized that Drake was also excited. I sat down next to him and handed him his glass. He thanked me, and we started talking again, now in a slightly different mood. Seizing the moment, I asked Drake if he was really alone with my mother. I spoke lightly, but with a touch of teasing, saying that he didn't seem like the kind of man who would settle for just one woman. He seemed surprised by the question, but then started laughing, and confirmed that yes, it was just my mother. I then asked him if he had a preference for women younger than him, in their 20s and 30s. Drake stared at me, and replied that he never really had a problem with that. If there was a good connection, anything could happen. We stared at each other, and the tension in the air was palpable, so I took the initiative and kissed him. Drake seemed surprised at first, but soon responded to the kiss, sighing with pleasure. The connection was immediate, and I realized I was getting what I wanted. Drake was completely hypnotized by me, and the bait was well placed. After a while of kissing, Drake pulled away and said, "Look, you're not going to tell your mom about this, are you? I really like her." Smiling, I asked him to relax. "Don't worry, Drake. I just found you attractive and didn't want to cause any trouble. I've always liked older men. You're more interesting and you know what you're doing." He seemed relieved, and the tension eased. I knew the situation was under control and that my plan was working. So we kissed again, and the atmosphere between us became more and more intense. We ended up surrendering to the moment on the sofa in the living room. We did our best to keep the sound of our activity loud enough so that my mother wouldn't come in too early. We spent about 40 minutes together, and the experience exceeded my expectations. Afterwards, I kissed Drake and asked him to keep it a secret, to which he quickly agreed. I ran to the kitchen and sent a message to my mother, asking her to come into the house. The poor thing had been waiting outside for over half an hour. When my mother returned, she came into the living room with a calm smile, pretending to be natural. Drake was so caught up in the moment he'd experienced a few minutes ago that he didn't even notice how long she'd been gone. He was clearly relaxed and content, completely involved in the moment. I watched from afar, noticing how hypnotized and satisfied he seemed to be. When my mother came into the kitchen to drop off the ice cream and pick up the glasses, she looked at me with a curious smile and asked if everything had gone according to plan. I confirmed that it had, and she already knew the answer because the signs were obvious. The enthusiastic shouts echoing from the room were a clear indication of the success of our plan. Finally, the ice cream was served, and we all enjoyed the dessert. Drake, who had an early appointment on Monday, had to say goodbye. After saying goodbye, he left, and my mother and I were very happy with the result. Shortly afterwards, my mother received notification of a transfer. It was Drake sending $2,000 to her account, with a message telling her to buy a present for herself and one for me. I exchanged a satisfied glance with my mother, and at that moment we knew for sure that the plan had been a success. I'm writing this story for you in August. It's been exactly 5 months since my mother and Drake have been together, or the 3 of us have been together, depending on how you look at it. This is how we've managed to survive and pay our bills. If you liked this real account of infidelity, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time.